I'll just introduce myself. My name's Paul Lawrence. I'm in the History Department at the Open University, so welcome to the Open University. I represent the OU for the Chase Management Board, and within Chase, I'm the chair of the Training and Development Group. So I have oversight of the joint training. So if you have thoughts on training, people who have experienced it or people who want it, do look out for me at lunchtime and come and bend my ear or send me an email. I also like to introduce on the panel Aviva Burnstock from the Courtauld and Maria Lauret from Sussex. And we're going to talk a little bit now about supervision. So one of the feedbacks we had from prior conferences is that students would like some kind of discussion about the dynamics of the supervisory relationship. So we're going to have each of us is going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a bit of a discussion, open it to the floor. This won't be a kind of rules and regulations, nitty-gritty of supervision, what do I need to do for my upgrade? What we're hoping to do is just talk a little bit about our experiences as supervisors and how it appears from our side of the process, and give you a chance to contribute thoughts and discussions. There's too many of you here for me to remember what questions anyone asks. So if you want to start a question with, my friend has a supervisor who does this, that's fine. Okay, so you can speak frankly here. I mean, there's cameras here, but they're pointed to us. I don't know what order should we go in. Shall I go first? Or yeah, is that okay? Oh yeah, I should say at the very end, I'm going to outline what's going to happen at lunch and in the afternoon. So don't worry about that. So I suppose the supervisory relationship, as I see it, it's about the co-production of knowledge, and it is, we say the supervisory relationship a lot, and we talk about the supervision bit, but we don't think about the relationship bit. It's very easy, as with lots of relationships, to just take it at face value and just kind of go with what's happening and not really interrogate, well, what kind of relationship do I want? And not to really speak to the people involved about your expectations. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship bit, some things which have occurred to me. So I suppose, first of all, you may or you may not end up friends with your supervisor. I was quite confused in my doctoral studies. I had two supervisors, one of which he was, I'd often be invited to parties at his house. It was kind of going out for a drink, trying to come out. The other supervisor was all business, would just kind of like, okay, see you at 9 o'clock, yep, bye. And I was kind of slightly perplexed by this because I was kind of, well, have I done something wrong with the other one? Or, friends had different experiences. So I suppose what I'm saying is neither is necessarily appropriate. You may, I kind of phrased that wrongly. I have a colleague at the moment who very much involves his doctoral students in his social life, and that's just the way he likes to take it. I consciously decide, I'm kind of reasonably reserved with my students. Like if I'm at a conference with my students, yeah, we'll go out for a drink, but I don't I like to be kind of slightly separate because I feel personally I can, if I need to critique someone's work quite heavily, I can do that better if I haven't just been out drinking with them the night before. But that's not to say that there's a good or a bad. It's just to kind of flag up different supervisors do things differently. It's also not, it's important to remember it's not a static relationship. I kind of think of it as a bit like a seesaw with you on one end and your supervisors on the other end. And at the beginning, I suppose which way around is it? One end's firmly on the ground. So your supervisor knows much more than you and will be quite directive in the relationship in saying you should do this and you should do that. And then towards the middle of your PhD, you both kind of know what you're doing, and it's a bit freer. And then towards the end, you'll be, I guess, up in the air, and the supervisor would just be letting you do it. And that aspect can be hard to grasp sometimes because that withdrawal of advice can seem like distance, and you might feel like you might be getting you discuss your plans, and your supervisor will say, "That's fine, yeah, go ahead." And you'd be like, "Oh," and people can find that quite unsettling if they don't really realise that. Sometimes that's consciously done. So you might get a draft back at the beginning. You've got lots of, you should just, and then towards the end, you start getting comments with like, yeah, that's fine. And it can be a bit unsettling, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It might be your supervisor consciously passing the responsibility for the knowledge production to you. I would say it is a kind of codependent relationship. You're obviously dependent on your supervisor, but don't forget your supervisor invests quite a lot of their professional practice in your success. You know, whether you being successful matters quite a lot to your supervisor, which is like a dynamic that is sometimes missed. I suppose other comments, other things that occurred to me are it's quite important, I think, to have a fairly frank discussion fairly near the beginning of your supervisory relationship about expectations, about the dynamics of the relationship. So it's a bit like with any kind of relationship, particularly if, let's say, you're in a couple, you might tend, some couples are better than others at kind of expressing what they want in a relationship. Some supervisors are better than this as others. It's perfectly acceptable towards the beginning to say to your supervisor, okay, so how do we work this? You know, are you someone who likes to be really, you know, some supervisors tend to be really, okay, we're going to meet exactly every 3 weeks. It'll be 9 o'clock in the morning. You know, do it like this. I'll give you written feedback within a day. You take the notes. Others like to be much more discursive and free. One might suit you better than the other. And it's perfectly okay to say, well, I would feel much better if we could run the supervisions like this. So a kind of frank discussion about how it's going to work is entirely appropriate. You know, it's best to have that than to kind of assume, oh, well, this is what will happen, or to leave things unsaid. And I suppose lastly, in terms of the relationship, your supervisors will be quite focused on the academic content of your studies, particularly initially. But as Vicky was saying, there is the research bit of your doctorate, and then there's the developing you as a researcher bit. And what you may well find, although not invariably, is that your supervisor is very focused on the academic bits, but like how to position yourself in your CV, how to gain different skills and experience. It doesn't necessarily naturally occur to all supervisors to talk to you about that at the appropriate time. So again, it's perfectly okay for you to prompt your supervisor to say, well, you know, now I'm midway through my second year, I'm thinking about, you know, what things do I need on my CV to get a job? Or I'm thinking about moving into the museums and galleries sector, how do I kind of work that? So shifting away from a purely academic content to the supervision is, again, you know, perfectly acceptable to do, but you might want to kind of suggest that. You know, it's tempting to think, oh, well, my supervisor will mention that when the time comes, but they may not. I suppose that's where, so a few minutes from me. We'll pass over to you.
Do people find it annoying that this flicks over and over in the same sequence? Could we not stop it just for a minute?
It's quite distracting.
I don't know.
Is it possible?
If there's anyone in the control, we can freeze it.
We can just turn it off, can we? That'd be great. Then you don't have to... Look, that's brilliant. Not that I think I'm so important, but, you know, I found it annoying before. I've been asked to speak specifically about practice-based PhDs because I come from the Department of Conservation and Technology at the Courtauld Institute. The Courtauld, of course, is art history, but they also have conservation of wall paintings and easel paintings. I'm the head of easel painting conservation, and as part of that, I supervise PhDs that are not only academic archival type PhDs, but also practice-based. So that means it could involve, for example, examining paintings using scientific methods, or trying to get information about how a picture's made and how it was constructed, together with information about patronage and function and so on. So all the PhDs that I supervise involve a practical component of research, original research always. So for the first time examining paintings by Reynolds of a certain type, for example, contemporary PhD, or Milevich or other artists. And then also working in collaboration with art historians. So the co-supervision is a very important part. It's interdisciplinary, and that might be with an art historian who would support that aspect of the work, as well as in my department, me supporting the technical side, but also sometimes scientific advisors and support. So it's extremely interdisciplinary and very important. And it's kind of, for me, in these practice-based PhDs, a brave new world of discovery right from the very beginning. So although things are quite well planned out, I think, and I'm hearing that perhaps the ideas are kind of quite freely planned out for other sorts of humanities-based PhDs, it tends to be slightly more organised at the beginning. So if you have to actually examine objects, you have to get permission to do that, you have to organise it so that you know what you're looking at, what your research questions are, really in advance of the PhD starting. So that sort of, that makes a bit of a difference. And then there's the discussion with the co-supervisor, which the student has to then navigate. And that can be really interesting, and it's certainly interesting for me as the supervisor of the practical part of the work, when I speak to an art historian who may have no interest whatsoever or very little interest in the physical object and how it's made. And together we're supposed to support something that that's novel and original. And so the student then has to see both sides of the coin. So right at the very beginning, I think that supervisory relationship is perhaps different from a more straightforward PhD of concepts and archival research, in that the collaborating supervisors and the student are in the same boat of discovery. So very much they're on an equal footing right from the beginning. So that can be unnerving, although I must say that I always choose my PhD students who can cope with that right at the beginning. It's not a random idea, and you know, you want to support your PhD students so that they can succeed in that kind of arrangement. Some more than others manage to do that, and that's something that's a challenge I think the supervisors and the students have to look at. So what's the balance of it? One of the points you asked us to talk about was what's the balance of instruction and independent research? Well, really, the instruction part of it would be perhaps identifying and learning new skills. For example, how do we examine a painting? You know, do I need to learn to do X-rays or infrared reflectography or some technique that I haven't formally known how to do? So that involves instruction. But then perhaps learning a novel technique, something new that's not on offer at the Courtauld, that could be on offer elsewhere. So the supervisor then has to try to organise that with some collaborating institution and find some common ground. And so that can be quite an adventure too, I think. And it depends on how game the student is to go off to Italy, say, to go to this new laboratory where they do something new and to do that. But from my point of view, I also find that equality in the relationship comes quite early on, and in particular successful, where I, as the supervisor, and perhaps the other supervisor, actually are involved. So we'll go on site, we'll go and see a picture at the Palazzo Pitti together, we will go up the ladder outside the administrative building where we have to actually take a sample from the picture, and we'll together work through the difficulties at the Prado in the store, and together we'll try and identify some particular problems. Say the painting's in terrible condition and we can't see what we thought we'd see of the technique, you know, how are we going to get around that? So we're sort of working together towards doing something original and new, and I think that's important too. The other side of the relationship, of course, is the support. Not all students speak English the same way, they don't all write to the same standard, so as a supervisor you have to respond to the individual student's needs, and sometimes that editorial input is very heavy-handed, or not heavy-handed is a bad word, or invasive, I think, and sometimes students write so brilliantly that you think, I could never do that. I've had a couple of students like that. I'm not sure I could express that any better, and certainly you've expressed it better than I ever could. So that sort of ability to bring something as a supervisor, support or critical evaluation of writing is also important, and it will really vary depending on the student. So knowledge of the student's ability is important, and that can also develop over time. So I find that also quite exciting and sometimes difficult. But there are ways around all these sorts of problems. Sometimes if the English language expression isn't fantastic, but you've got a student who's fantastic at science, you can get the support of another student who's very good, and you might get a small budget to help them with basic editing before the supervisor even sees it. That's happened in one case for me. That's one extreme, of course the others, where the student writes terribly well. And then the business of getting things in on time and not letting, very important for Chase studentships, which are only 3 years, and I think that's really different from PhDs in my day, sort of 30 years ago, when you could mess around for the first year and find your subject. I think that really can't happen now. In a 3-year funded PhD, you have to get on the case really quickly and perhaps write chapter 1 in the first year for your upgrade. I think there's a bit of discussion about whether this can actually work. But to have a student who's agile enough to do something, mess around for the first year, and then suddenly get it together by the final year, it's very exceptional. So I always advise my Chase students to be very well organised and to deliver drafts on time. And I chase up those drafts and, you know, have you managed to deliver that draft? You know, am I going to get it next week? You know, how much longer do you think you're going to have? That I find myself doing that a lot more than I used to as a PhD supervisor. But I do think it's important, because how can you survive unfunded in your writing up year? It used to be that there was a 4th writing up year, but I'm not sure that people can work unfunded anymore in a writing up year, but one aims to get it done in 3 years, so that's very important too. Okay, so finally, on the point of co-creation of knowledge, I encourage all students to publish along the way parts of their PhD in peer-reviewed journals and to contribute to conferences, and that's part of becoming an independent researcher, and those skills are important particularly if you want to be an academic or if you want to work as a curator in a museum. To have that sort of experience is important as part of your PhD. And again, you can do collaborative publications with your students, or you can do them with other people who have been involved in the process, and encourage them also to share their knowledge with the wider public and with the scholarly public is also important to do, which obviously the Chase Consortium advances as well. So that's what I've really got to say, except that at the end, the student's always the expert in the subject, and I am always humbled by the students' knowledge at the end in their particular area, and always extremely proud of them when they graduate with their PhD.
Thank you. Maria.
I was asked to speak from the discipline of English, and then I thought, but really, supervision is one of the very few, perhaps the only area of academic work where we don't really know what each other's doing. We don't. It is very much a one-on-one situation. That's the value, the strength, the privilege, and that's why it's precious as well. But to find out, in other words, to represent supervision in English, I can't do, because I don't know that much about how other people do it. I get snippets, of course, the models that Paul sketched out of it. On the one hand, a friend, on the other hand, the taskmaster, let's say. Those are two poles of a continuum that is familiar, I think, to everyone. And we co-examine with each other and so on. So then you do see, and we co-supervise too. So occasionally I do see other people at work. But still I have this sense that I can only really speak for myself when I say the following things. Don't want to repeat what Paul has said. That what you sketched out, Paul, was very similar to what I do and what I know. Rather than the friend and the business-like approach, I would probably say somewhere between, I see my role as a balance between a mentor and an examiner, perhaps. Somebody who judges, but also somebody who guides and facilitates and inspires and tries to enthuse. So, and to some extent, those are contradictory duties, perhaps, but I find them very rewarding and interesting to do them together. So that within the professional sphere, it is possible to combine those roles. And after all, teaching is like that too, at undergraduate level. So facilitating and guiding, and those are the kinds of words I would use. Instruction, when I was thinking about that, because we were asked to think about what's the balance of instruction and independent research. I thought instruction, that's so inappropriate in a way to supervision, but it's not actually, because there are a lot of things, especially when it comes to the professional development that Paul talked about at the end and that Vicky also addressed in her opening statement, about when it's not just about your project or your research, but it's about you becoming a person in the world, a professional person in the world. Then there is a lot of stuff around a conference presentation or your first article, and how you draft it, and that's just about instructing or telling, just sharing your knowledge and your experience of it. Naturally, that balance, and academic writing as well, actually, even though we think we learn that at master's level, I think thesis writing is a very particular thing, particular length and kind of density of it. Those kinds of things also lend themselves to instruction. So you have quite a bit of that at the beginning to really find your feet in the project and how to communicate it. And then again, really very much at the end, when it is about, is this ready for submission yet? What needs to be done? In the scale of distant or allowing a lot of freedom or being a micromanager, I'm very much on the micromanagement side. Some of my students are in the audience. I ask them to heckle me if necessary, because I ask people to start writing pretty much from the beginning. But I like to think, of course, that that's by negotiation. But I appreciate that it may not always feel like that. So another thing that we were asked to consider was, what misapprehensions have we come across where there's a misunderstanding about what each other's role is. And I think one of those is perhaps that you have 3 years to discover yourself as much as your project and so on, and that you should be given all the time in the world to do that. And that's just not what a modern PhD is like, as Aviva just outlined. Another one is perhaps the opposite, is to think that your supervisor is the ultimate authority, and that there is no way that we possibly can be, and nor would that be a good thing, I would add. I do see sometimes, this is over quite a long career now, people who have just completed their PhDs who look to me like clones of their supervisor. And I find that worrying, and it's something that I consciously try to avoid. I don't know how possible that is, and again, that's something that needs to be worked in dialogue, where a student needs more space for their own work, and not just to find out to read what you think they should read, but to want to go in another direction, is very much something that you need to assert as well, or need to create the space for yourselves, because it's not always conscious, is it? And it's not always deliberate. But as soon as you feel forced in a certain direction, I think there should be space, and hopefully the relationship is such that you can resist that and can do your own thing. So my sense, rather than even thinking of the co-creation of knowledge, really, is that from the beginning you are the knowledge producer. And I'm the one who is making that possible, or making sure that you jump through the hoops at the right time, and that you get the resources you need, and that you take the opportunities that there are for you to share that and to test it, of course. Because there's a lot of, you can test it. I'm not the only examiner. You test yourself at every conference that you go to, and every paper that you give. So all those kinds of things, really. But the ultimate authority thing is one referred to several times already, where sometimes it's a kind of childlike thing, isn't it, that we're not necessarily, again, aware of. And I certainly feel that as a scholar as well. I was recently at a symposium with a lot of people whose work I'd used in my latest book. And part of me didn't really believe these people existed, and that I was going to meet them, and I was going to be at a table with them like we are now. So there is that kind of, if you admire somebody or somebody's work, at least, then there is that tendency to think that they know it all, and that they can give you the ultimate judgment. But that is just not the case, and part of maturing as a scholar is to find that out and to be able to take liberties and take risks yourself. Ideally, I think, the balance as it goes from, let's say, mentor stroke examiner or facilitator should end up as colleague. And many of my previous PhD students who are my colleagues now, and I forget that they were once my students. And that happens actually quite quickly. And certainly in the exchange, which, as I said, is a privileged one, and no supervisor that I know of, certainly not at this level, working with Chase students, takes anyone on against their will. There's a lot of investment on our part that's not just part of our jobs, but that's very much interest as well. So the balance very much shifts towards an exchange that is fruitful for both parties. And I can't tell you how much I've learned from my PhD students and continue to. And there was a moment just earlier when we were having coffee when one of my students said to me, on this multilingual poetry thing, I just came across something that might interest you. Of course, that's normally what I do for him, but he's doing that for me as well. And that's how it will almost certainly end up, but sometimes that's how it is all the way through as well. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks both. I mean, just thinking about that, it just struck me that what we're all talking about, I think, is this tension that you will inevitably find between what's inherently a creative process, where you want to explore and branch off and make your thesis everything it could be, and an intensely practical process that you need to map that onto, that says at these points you need to have done this, within 3 years you need to have done that. Mm-hmm. And so what your supervisors should be trying to do with you, and that's the whole trick of it really, is to navigate that balance between exploration and creation and production. Because it doesn't go away. As an academic, the thing that we face all the time is the whole trick of it with any piece of research is to know that's enough, because it's never going to be done. That's the thing that people kind of miss with the, have I done my PhD? You could always do more work on what you're doing, but the trick is to say, I've done enough now to write that bit and publish it. And so what your supervisor should be doing is pushing you at certain times. No, I think you can do a bit better there. I think you can do a bit more. But actually, no, that's enough. You've done enough there now, and you can move on. And so there is that kind of tension between what your thesis could be and what it can be, if you see what I mean. You could push forever into new directions and never finish it. So it's that tension. And I think partly that's where I come back to the kind of just talk to your supervisor explicitly about what you want. How much do you want to be pushed? Some students are very amenable to being really intellectually stretched a long way. And others feel like, well,
not so much. Yeah.
I've got to get my PhD very soon. It's got to be done in 3 years. I've already decided I don't want an academic career. So there's differences, but your supervisor won't necessarily, glean from your kind of attitude what your impressions are there. So do kind of talk explicitly to them about how you're finding it. And just on one point that was mentioned with co-supervision, which I think we all have now, that is one thing that I would roll that into your discussion about how supervision happens. I would strongly suggest, if you're not seeing both of your supervisors in the room at the same time at most of your supervisions, talk to them both about, okay, so how, if they've not done it to you first, say, well, how are we going to manage this? Because, I have, again, a colleague who had 2 supervisors at I went to university, but they would give him completely conflicting advice, and they didn't like each other. So it was very hard for him as a student to navigate. Now that doesn't happen very often, but even if your supervisors get on and agree, if you're getting different sets of comments, talk to them about how do I manage that? Have an explicit discussion. But I think, should we have a few? I don't know if people want to kind of throw some questions at us from the floor, just make comments. I think we've got 2 helpful assistants with microphones, so do wait for them if anyone wants to say anything.
I'm quite interested to know where the request for this session came from, what occasioned that.
I think it was in the feedback for our previous encounters. We kind of suggested, what would you like to hear about? And this was one of the... We've maybe covered everything so fully that... really not? Yeah, no, there you go. Yeah,
People hear me? Or do you need it? Yeah, okay, sorry. I know there's the facility through Chase to have supervision from, I don't know if any of you are the right people to ask about this, but I know through Chase there's the facility to have supervision from outside your own institution. I just wondered if people, if you had any information about how that's been taken up already, or if there's anything we could do to maybe make it facilitate people taking that up.
Okay, well, we do have a kind of outline of a policy. There are kind of various levels of co-supervision you could have. So you can have formal 50-50 co-supervision. We have a procedure for that, but you can also have, there's various levels below that. So you might just want to one-off or meet another academic a couple of times just for some advice on a particular bit of your thesis. And again, that should be something that you would talk to your supervisor about. Supervisors across Chase would generally be amenable to approaches of those kinds, either for, can you just meet up with me? I mean, usually, if you just want to meet someone, can I just talk to you for an hour or so about this aspect of my work, that wouldn't really need any kind of formal arrangement. I think most people would be open to that. If it's a bit more than that, could you read the draft of this chapter, then again, talk to your supervisor about it. It may be that they'll make the first approach if you've identified someone. But yes, certainly we're keen to encourage that. It's one of the things that we're not... Some of the doctoral training consortia are, I think, insisting on having 2 supervisors in different institutions, and we've decided we don't really want to take a mechanical approach, but we are very receptive to proposals for co-supervision.
And I might just add that I think that also is possibly a task for your supervisor, that when there is expertise on a particular part of your project that she doesn't have, and that is not and that's available within the institution or within Chase, ideally as well, as we get more familiar with what each other's doing, that your supervisor would point you in the direction of that person and says, why don't you email so and so and see if you can get to talk to them, or have an email exchange, or a Skype conversation, or a supervisory visit or something. Mm-hmm. So I think that also should be part of the conversation between you, the possibility to benefit from other people's expertise within Chase.
Mm-hmm. If I can just add, I mean, one of the benefits of actually making it a more formal arrangement is that Chase can support expenses that, you know, to travel between institutions to actually enable that sort of relationship. So that, you know, that's something not all supervisors may necessarily be aware of that. So it may be up to you to inform them. Any other comments? I mean, one thing I suppose I would add, and again, I'm coming to this at the Open University. I was for 4 years an associate dean, and I was responsible for all of the faculty's doctoral students. So on the few occasions that there was an absolute car crash at the end of someone's doctoral career, it would usually end up on my desk in these big binders. And not to kind of worry you unduly, but the kind of a common factor to all of these was a kind of misunderstanding of who was doing what, which was probably apparent to most parties fairly early on, but which nobody really said anything about. So I think one of the things to take away from this session is that there is a big variety of supervisory practice. You know, you might be top friends with your supervisor, you might not. They might really push you with a kind of, no, you've got to do that, and then I want you to do that. Or they might be like, go off and explore for 3 months and then kind of talk to me about it. So there's a big variety of practice, but you should at all points feel able to discuss what you need out of the supervisory relationship, and you should feel free to do that. So if you might find your friends have supervisors who are different, but they should both essentially be doing the same thing, which is this pushing you to explore, but bringing you back in to say, well, no, now we've got to write that up. And, you know, you should be feeling supported in that process of, you know, quite scary process of exploring something that you don't know about, but also then kind of writing it up in a timely manner. So if you're finding that's not happening, you should tell someone. You know, you will have different mechanisms in your institutions for how you raise these kind of concerns. But that's the main thing to worry about. Not, oh, well, my supervisor does this and that one doesn't, but it's how you're feeling about the process. Yep, we've got one. Can we have a microphone down there? Thanks.
It's just an observation, really, on what you were saying about having two different types of supervisor. I find myself in that situation where one is very old school, traditionalist, Oxbridge style of pushing me, and the other is very much into the whole training, networks, PPD aspect of a PhD, which is necessary. I find it a really good combination, and I would endorse that, actually, because then when I've got one aspect of the PhD to look at, I would go to that person, and the other, I go to the other.
Right.
So actually, it's working really well for me.
So they're really complementing
They really complement each other. They're not necessarily the best of friends either. It's not that they don't like each other, they do, but, you know, they're not out for a drink every night. So it really does work from two different perspectives there, and I find it helpful career-wise from one and research-wise from the other.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thanks. Excellent. That's a more positive note to end.
Yeah, it's a good thing to do.
Thank you.